Welcome to the Dark History Podcast. I'm your host, Ben Carter. In the shadowy corridors of the United Nations, a clandestine network operated for years, its deeds going unnoticed, unreported, and unpunished. At the heart of this operation was a man named Michel Sidibé, a high-ranking official within the United Nations Development Program. Sidibé, originally from Mali, had a reputation as a charismatic figure, a man deeply committed to humanitarian work. But beneath this veneer of respectability, a far more sinister picture began to emerge. Sources began to leak information, painting Sidibé as a master manipulator, using his position of influence to exploit the vulnerable. Internal investigations into his actions revealed a complex web of corruption, coercion, and human trafficking. Individuals, often women and children from impoverished backgrounds, were being brought into the United Nations under false pretenses. They were promised opportunities for education, work, and a better life. But instead, they were met with a reality far removed from these promises. The victims were coerced into a life of servitude, their passports taken, their communication with the outside world restricted. They were trapped in a cycle of abuse and exploitation, their pleas for help falling on deaf ears. The people they were supposed to trust, those in positions of power, were the very ones betraying them. But how had this network managed to operate undetected within the United Nations, an institution that prides itself on advocating for human rights and dignity? The answer lies in a culture of silence and complicity. Sidibé and his accomplices had installed a system of fear and intimidation, threatening anyone who dared to speak out. Whistleblowers were silenced, their careers destroyed, their lives put in danger. This culture of fear created an environment where abuse could flourish, unchecked and unchallenged. The investigation into Sidibé and his network also uncovered evidence of financial corruption, with funds intended for humanitarian projects being siphoned off for personal gain. This money was used to maintain the network, paying off those who might pose a threat and further entrenching the system of abuse and exploitation. As the investigation progressed, a sense of shock and disbelief echoed through the corridors of the United Nations. There was a collective failure to comprehend how such a network could operate within its walls, how someone like Sidibé, a man hailed as a champion of humanitarian work, could be at the heart of such a scandal. It was a revelation that shook the United Nations to its core, prompting a wave of introspection and reform. The exposure of this network revealed a dark underbelly, a stark contrast to the lofty ideals the institution purports to uphold. The scandal served as a chilling reminder that even within the heart of an organization dedicated to peace and justice, the very worst of human nature can still find a way to manifest. The investigation into Sidibé's network was a labyrinthine task, with each discovery leading to an even deeper layer of corruption and abuse. It was a network rooted in manipulation and sustained by fear. Each victim had been carefully selected, their vulnerability exploited, their hope for a better life twisted into a tool of control. A pattern emerged as investigators delved into the case. The victims were often from impoverished backgrounds, desperate for an escape from a life of poverty. They were enticed with promises of employment, opportunities, and a chance for a better life. Once they arrived at their destination, their passports were confiscated, their movements monitored, their every action controlled. As the investigators dug deeper, they uncovered more than just physical abuse. There was psychological manipulation, threats against families back home, and a deeply ingrained fear that kept the victims silent. They were trapped in a world where their captors were their only link to the outside, where they were forced to rely on the very people who were exploiting them. At the heart of this network was Sidibé, a man who had once been a beacon of hope for many. His fall from grace was a stark reminder of the capacity for evil even in those who profess to do good. His network was a complex web of power and control, a system that had been built over years of careful planning and execution. The audacity of the operation was chilling. Sidibé and his accomplices had not only managed to infiltrate the United Nations, but they had also manipulated the system to their advantage. They used their positions of power to silence dissent, to cover their tracks, and to maintain their network of abuse. They had turned an institution meant to protect and uphold human rights into a breeding ground for exploitation. As details of the network came to light, the international community was left reeling. The shock was palpable, the sense of betrayal deep. There was an outpouring of support for the victims, coupled with a growing demand for accountability. The world watched in anticipation as the United Nations grappled with the fallout from the scandal. This crisis presented an opportunity for change, a chance to rectify the systemic issues that had allowed such a network to flourish. The United Nations was forced to confront its own shortcomings, to examine its policies and procedures, and to take a hard look at its culture of silence. The exposure of Sidibe's network was a wake-up call, a grim reminder of the need for vigilance and accountability in the fight against human trafficking. Sidibe's web of influence stretched far and wide, roping in both willing accomplices and oblivious pawns. The network was a masterclass in manipulation, exploiting not only the victims, but also the very structure of the United Nations itself. Sidibe was at the center, pulling the strings, but he was far from alone. His accomplices held various positions within the organization, from security personnel to high-ranking officials, each playing a part in maintaining the network's operations. Among them was Antoine, a high-ranking official who had been with the United Nations for over 2 decades. A trusted figure within the organization, Antoine used his influence to shield the network from scrutiny. He was instrumental in facilitating the illegal transfer of victims, cloaking their movements under the guise of official UN business. His position granted him a certain level of immunity, a cloak of invisibility that he used to the network's advantage. Then there was Maria, a mid-level officer in the Human Resources Department. She was responsible for handling the paperwork and ensuring that the victims' employment records were manipulated to support the false narrative of their roles within the UN. Maria had been recruited by Sidibe early on, lured by promises of power and wealth. Her role was crucial in maintaining the illusion of legitimacy, in cloaking the trafficking operation in a veneer of bureaucratic normalcy. Security personnel were also part of this disturbing network. They were the gatekeepers, controlling the victims' movements, ensuring they remained within the confines of the UN premises, and preventing any attempts at escape. They operated under the command of a man named Dimitri, a former military officer with a reputation for ruthless efficiency. These key figures were supported by a larger network of individuals who, willingly or not, contributed to the operation's success. Some were fully aware of the network's true nature, while others were manipulated, their actions unknowingly supporting a system of exploitation. The power structure of Sidibe's network was both hierarchical and diffuse. While Sidibe was the linchpin, his accomplices held considerable power within their respective domains. This structure made the network resilient, capable of absorbing shocks and adapting to challenges. It was this resilience that allowed the network to operate undetected for so long, exploiting the very system that was designed to protect the vulnerable. The network had its roots deep within the bureaucratic labyrinth of the United Nations, with a level of sophistication that made it difficult to detect. Their operations were meticulously planned and executed, with each part of the network playing a specific role in the advancement of their agenda. For instance, the victims, most of whom were young women from developing nations, were often recruited under the guise of legitimate employment opportunities within the UN. They were promised positions as administrative staff, interpreters, or assistants, lured by the prospect of a stable income and the prestige associated with working for an international organization. Once they agreed to take up these jobs, they were transported to their new workplace under the pretext of official UN transfers. Antoine's role here was critical. His position within the organization allowed him to arrange these transfers without raising any alarm. He would prepare all the necessary documentation and ensure that the victim's travel was registered as official UN business. Upon arrival, the victims would be met by Dimitri and his team of security personnel, who would escort them to their accommodation, usually within the UN premises. The victims, most of whom were unaware of the true nature of their situation, would believe that this was part of the standard process for new employees. Maria would then come into the picture. She would create a fictitious employment record for each victim, assigning them to non-existent roles within the UN. These records served 2 main purposes. Firstly, they provided a cover for the victim's presence within the UN premises. Secondly, they created an illusion of legitimacy which would be useful in case of any potential investigations. The victims would then be forced into servitude, their freedom severely restricted by Dimitri's security team. They would be held captive, their movements monitored, and escape attempts thwarted. The victims were trapped in a world they didn't understand, their dreams of a better life turned into a nightmare. Meanwhile, Sidibe remained the master puppeteer, pulling the strings from behind the scenes. He ensured that the operation ran smoothly, managing any difficulties and dealing with potential threats to the network. He was the glue that held the network together, the driving force behind this grotesque exploitation machine. Despite the network's extensive reach within the UN, its existence remained a secret for years. The members of the network operated with a level of discretion that allowed them to avoid detection, exploiting a system designed to protect the world's most vulnerable. The brutality of the operation was hidden behind the veneer of the UN's emblematic blue emblem. The victims were forced into various forms of degrading labor, from domestic servitude to sexual exploitation. Many were subjected to physical and psychological abuse. Over time, the physical toll on the victims became apparent. They were often malnourished and exhibited signs of severe stress and trauma. The network had a perverse system of control over its victims. Dimitri and his security team used threats and violence to ensure compliance. Victims were often beaten and threatened with deportation or harm to their families back home. In some cases, victims were even forced to witness the punishment of other victims as a chilling warning of the consequences of disobedience. The sexual exploitation of victims was especially abhorrent. Women and girls were frequently forced into prostitution, their bodies sold to the highest bidder. Some of the victims were as young as 14 years old. The network had effectively turned the UN premises, a symbol of global peace and cooperation, into a horrific brothel. Sidibe and his cohorts also found ways to profit from the victims' labor. Some victims were forced to work in various roles within the UN, their wages pocketed by the network members. Other victims were made to work in businesses owned by members of the network or their associates. The network's operations were not confined within the walls of the UN complex. They also trafficked victims to diplomats and high-ranking officials in various countries. These victims served in the officials' homes, subjected to similar or worse forms of exploitation. Meanwhile, Maria continued to manage the victims' fictitious employment records. She ensured that their presence at the UN was always justified and their exploitation hidden in plain sight. As the atrocities escalated, the network's operations became more audacious. The victims were trafficked across international borders under the guise of official UN business, their passports and documentation controlled by the network. They were moved from one location to another, their identities erased and replaced with new ones, their lives reduced to mere commodities in the network's illicit trade. The network's insidious operations were a grotesque perversion of the UN's noble mission. The victims, lured with promises of a better life, found themselves trapped in a nightmare. The very institution they had trusted, the UN, had become the architect of their suffering. Their dreams of dignity and prosperity had turned into a reality of exploitation and abuse. Despite the chilling realities that unfolded under the umbrella of the revered United Nations, the victims' cries for help remained unheard for years on end. There was an eerie silence that shrouded the operations of the network, a silence that was as much a product of fear as it was of systemic neglect and corruption. Even within the walls of the UN, where the atrocities were being committed, many turned a blind eye to the victims' plight. Fearful of the network's power and influence, some chose to ignore the signs of exploitation, while others were simply oblivious to the network's operations. The victims, many of whom did not speak English or the local languages, were often unable to communicate their suffering effectively. Yet, amidst the gloom, there were some who dared to resist, to challenge the network's influence. These were not high-ranking officials or diplomats, but ordinary individuals who found the courage to stand against the network. One such individual was a janitor at the UN complex. He was an immigrant himself, having fled his war-torn homeland in search of a safe haven. Over time, he began to notice the unusual patterns of the victims' lives, their long hours, their weary faces, their reluctance to interact. His suspicions deepened when he found discarded travel documents in the trash, all bearing the names of young women who worked at the UN. Despite the risks, the janitor began to secretly collect evidence of the network's operations. He would carefully retrieve and store the discarded documents and made a log of the victim's unusual work hours. He also took note of Sidibé's frequent interactions with the victims and the fear that his presence seemed to instill in them. At the same time, he began to reach out to the victims, offering them a sympathetic ear and a helping hand. He could not provide them with legal help or protection from the network, but he could give them something just as precious, the knowledge that they were not alone, that someone cared about their plight. The janitor's efforts were not without risk. He was constantly under the threat of being discovered by the network, of becoming a victim himself. Yet he persisted, driven by his conviction that the victims deserved justice. His resistance, although modest, was a beacon of hope for the victims. It was a testament to the human spirit's ability to resist, to fight against the odds, even in the face of overwhelming adversity. Unbeknownst to him, his actions would soon set off a chain of events that would expose the network's operations to the world. But for now, the network continued to operate with impunity, its crimes hidden under layers of silence and complicity. Meanwhile, halfway across the globe, a journalist named Rebecca Nguyen was investigating a string of disappearances of young women in her native Vietnam. Unraveling the threads of these cases led her to a disturbing conclusion. These women were not merely disappearing. They were being trafficked, potentially on an international scale. The pattern was unmistakable, and the common thread was their dream of working for the United Nations, a dream that was being exploited by malevolent forces. The trail of evidence led her to New York. With dogged determination and the help of local journalists, she began to connect the dots, slowly realizing that the UN, the very symbol of peace and global cooperation, was being used as a front for a human trafficking network. As she delved deeper, Rebecca came across a series of anonymous online posts detailing the experiences of victims working at the UN. The posts were filled with hints of coercion, manipulation, and fear. The author spoke of discarded travel documents, long work hours, and a certain high-ranking official named Sidibé. The dots began to connect. Rebecca realized the magnitude of the story she was uncovering. It was not just a local issue, but a global scandal waiting to explode. She knew that she needed irrefutable evidence to expose this network, and so she turned her attention to finding the author of the anonymous posts, who, she believed, was a janitor at the United Nations complex. After weeks of searching, she finally found him. The janitor, a humble immigrant who was risking his life for justice, had amassed a trove of evidence. He handed over the documents he had collected, the logs he had kept, and his personal observations. Armed with this evidence, Rebecca was ready to expose the network. She knew this story would send shockwaves through the international community, shaking the very foundations of the United Nations. But the truth had to come out. The victims deserved justice, and the world deserved to know the dark secret that was being harbored within the United Nations. As Rebecca prepared to publish her findings, the network remained oblivious to the storm that was about to descend upon them. Their reign of terror was about to be challenged like never before. The release of Rebecca's exposé was like a lightning bolt in a clear sky. The revelations were shocking, the international community reeled, and the United Nations was forced into the spotlight, the dark underbelly of its operations exposed for all to see. The world learned of the exploitation, the coercion, the manipulation, all carried out under the guise of diplomacy and international cooperation. The evidence was irrefutable, the narrative inescapable. The UN had been used as a front for a human trafficking network. The aftermath was immediate and far-reaching. Sidibé, the high-ranking official implicated in the scandal, was swiftly suspended from all duties. An internal investigation was launched, and soon more officials were identified as part of the network. The ripples of the exposé spread far and wide, affecting not just the perpetrators, but also the victims who had been trapped in the network. For the victims, the exposure brought a glimmer of hope. The chains of manipulation and fear that had kept them silent began to loosen. They found the courage to step forward, adding their voices to the narrative that was now sweeping the globe. With each new account, the scale of the network's operations became clearer. This was not an isolated incident, but a complex and sophisticated operation that had been running for years, perhaps even decades. Justice became the rallying cry, echoing through the corridors of power, demanding accountability. Trials were scheduled, charges were filed, and the legal machinery began to grind. Across the world, countries pledged to tighten their regulations, to scrutinize their officials, to ensure that such a scandal could never happen again. At the United Nations, the shockwaves of the revelations led to a seismic shift. The organization was forced to confront the reality of its failings, to acknowledge the role it had unwittingly played in the network's operations. In the wake of the scandal, the UN pledged to overhaul its systems, to implement stricter oversight and accountability measures to ensure the protection of its employees. The journey towards justice, however, was not without its challenges. The network had been deeply ingrained, its tendrils reaching far and wide. It resisted the attempts to dismantle it, fought back against the exposure. But the momentum was against them. The world was watching, the victims were speaking out, and the truth was finally out in the open. The network had been exposed, its operations revealed, and its days were numbered. The fight for justice had only just begun. In the years that followed the exposure of the human trafficking network operating inside the United Nations, the world saw a dramatic shift in the discourse surrounding human trafficking. The scandal, as horrifying as it was, managed to shine a harsh light on the hidden corners of bureaucracy and officialdom where such crimes had been allowed to fester. The UN, in particular, faced the brunt of this scrutiny. The organization, which had always been seen as the vanguard of human rights and justice, found itself in the uncomfortable position of being the perpetrator of the very crimes it had been committed to eradicating. This paradox was not lost on the global community. Nations, organizations, and individuals alike rallied to demand change, not just in the form of punitive action against the perpetrators, but in structural reforms within the United Nations itself. In response, the UN embarked on an ambitious and comprehensive reform process. New protocols and safeguards were put in place, aimed at protecting its employees and preventing such incidents from occurring in the future. A robust whistleblower policy was introduced, along with independent oversight bodies to monitor compliance and address grievances. The organization also increased its commitment to training and awareness programs, ensuring that every member of its staff was educated about the signs of human trafficking and the mechanisms to report it. These changes, however, weren't confined to the UN. The scandal had a ripple effect, prompting other international organizations and governments to re-evaluate their own systems. The need for greater transparency, accountability, and safeguards against such heinous crimes became a global imperative. National governments introduced stricter regulations and penalties for human trafficking, and international cooperation on the issue intensified. The legacy of the scandal was thus a double-edged sword. On one side, it revealed a deep-seated rot within an institution trusted to uphold the highest standards of human rights. On the other, it sparked a global movement for change, leading to systemic reforms and an increased commitment to the fight against human trafficking. The journey was fraught with challenges and setbacks, but it was a journey that had to be undertaken. The world could no longer ignore the dark underbelly of power and privilege, and the human cost it exacted. The fight against human trafficking had finally moved from the shadows to the forefront of global consciousness. Yet, as we draw this narrative to a close, a number of unanswered questions still persist. Most crucially, how could such a vast human trafficking network operate in an institution like the United Nations, a symbol of hope and justice for many across the globe? How deep and pervasive was the rot? And perhaps, most importantly, how can we ensure that such a tragedy never repeats itself? While the UN has taken significant steps to address the issue, the effectiveness of these reforms remains to be seen. It is a long road to rebuilding trust and credibility. Even as we laud the progress made, we must remain vigilant. The commitment to continuous oversight, training, and review cannot be allowed to wane with time. The fight against human trafficking must remain a priority, not a reactionary measure in the face of scandal. The scandal also underscores the importance of maintaining a critical eye on all institutions, regardless of their stature or mission. Human trafficking is not an isolated issue, confined to the dark corners of society. It is a global problem, requiring a global response. As we have seen, even the most respected institutions are not immune. The presence of such a network within the UN serves as a stark reminder that vigilance and accountability must be upheld across the board. In reflecting on these events, we are reminded of the human cost. The victims of this network, many of whom remain unnamed and unknown, are a testament to the brutal realities of human trafficking. Their experiences serve as a call to action. The UN scandal was a wake-up call to the world. It laid bare the harsh truth that human trafficking can infiltrate even the most unlikely of places. It shattered the illusion of invulnerability and, in doing so, forced a reckoning. From this painful chapter, new efforts to combat human trafficking have emerged, driven by a renewed understanding of the insidious nature of this crime and the urgent need to address it. The legacy of this scandal, then, is one of resilience and reform. It is a story of betrayal, but also of a quest for justice and accountability. It is a stark reminder of the work that still lies ahead in the global fight against human trafficking. But most importantly, it is a call to action. A call to ensure that the lessons learned from this scandal are not forgotten, but used as a catalyst for lasting change. Thanks for listening. This has been the Dark History Podcast. If you enjoyed today's episode, be sure to follow us wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you'd like to support the show, subscribe to the Forbidden Knowledge Network on Patreon. Subscribe now.